React Redux is an API that helps us elevate the local state of ReactJS components to a global state. So other components can have access to that state without the traditional passing down status props through the trickle-down method. If you don't know what I'm talking about when I say the trickle-down method, I'll have a link in the description below or a card on the top right to a very brief video I did. I think it's 2 minutes, 2.5 minutes, basically describing how ReactJS handles propagating data throughout its system. With all that said, let's begin. So I have a basic ReactJS app up and running. If you want to know how to do that, I'll have a link in the description below or a card on the top right. All this app does is create this page right here. We have a welcome header component with a name Rex, and then we have all of these individual little blog posts with a name Rex. These Rexes come from a different variable than this guy up here. So I've actually defined twice in my program the exact same value Rex, two different variables. This is okay, because if you want to change the name Rex for this whole app, we just have to change it here and here, and it's a simple string. It's not really a huge hassle. But what if this Rex, this name, this state was more complex? Objects and arrays and booleans and numbers and all that stuff. Well, we have to go here, change all this complex state, and then navigate over to app.js and then mirror all of those changes in this file here. This is a big no-no. So what we're going to do is we're just going to elevate this name Rex to a global state so it's in one place. So when we change it in that one place, it propagates that change throughout the whole app. So how do we get started with React Redux then? Well, we need to install React Redux. I'm just writing it here. This is obviously not the console. I'm assuming you know how to use npm if you know how to use ReactJS. So we have to install two packages, React Redux and Redux. Now, what's the difference between the two? Well, Redux is a state management system for any type of JavaScript application. React Redux is a state management system for ReactJS applications. React Redux depends on Redux. So you need to install Redux in order to get this guy up and running. So how do we get it up and running once we have it installed? Well, there are two sides to this coin. One side is we create a store and we create a reducer. The second half of that coin is that we connect to the store in order to consume that state. So let's tackle the first half first. What do? There's 3 steps. So on the left here, I have a folder called Redux just to keep our code organized. I'm going to create a file or a script called store.js. You can name it whatever you want. So 3 steps. The first step is we have to create a store with a function called createStore that we get from Redux. We start React Redux with Redux, not React Redux. And so we create that store. I'm going to call my store one-stop-shop, like that. We create the store. We'll get back to the argument listings in a second. And then we export the store. So I'm going to export default, one-stop-shop. You could have easily exported it right away like this, but I like to do default exports. So that's the first step. The second step is we create a function. And this function is a reducer. Now the reducer's job, we'll get back to the argument listing in a second. The reducer's job is to influence or manage the global state. You might think, well, shouldn't this manage the global state? The answer is no. This just points to the global state. This guy does the actual logic, the actual actions, the actual manipulating of the global state. So that's the second step. We create a reducer. The third step is we wrap our entire app in a provider, and that provider is provided by React from React Redux. And so we wrap our entire app. That provider has an attribute or a prop called store that points to the store it's going to be providing from. So it's going to be one-stop shop. If your program doesn't automatically import that one-stop shop we just created, you need to manually import it. So we wrap our program in the provider like this. There we go. So that's the third step. So let's go back and fill out the argument listings. So there are 3 arguments to creating a store. The first argument is the reducer that's going to manage the store. The second argument is optional. Any sort of state you want to override the default state with. And so you might think, shouldn't the default state be defined when you create the store? The answer is no. The default state is defined within your reducer. Now, why is this the case? It's because you can have many types of reducers. Let's say we had an animal reducer. So animal reducer would have its own global state, its own stuff here. And you could just plug out the types of reducers you have in your store. And when you do that, your provider would provide different information, different global state. And so we define a global state in the reducer, not in the createStore argument parameter signature listing. So the first argument is the thing that's going to manage the store. The second argument is the thing optional if you want to override the default state, which we'll get to in a second. And the third argument is also optional. It's outside the scope of this tutorial, but it's enhancements or middleware. Now there's a middleware called, just to give you an idea of what it is. So you plug in middleware into your React Redux in your create store here, and it enhances the abilities of your store. So there's a middleware called Thunk that allows you to do asynchronous calls to your store. Again, outside the scope of this video. For now, we're just going to deal with the first two arguments. So let's define the default state. Now we could define this default state. There's two arguments to main reducer. First argument is the default state. The second argument is actions or action, which we'll get to in the latter half of the video. We could define the default state in the argument listing, but that would get messy. So let's define it here. We're going to say default state. You can name it whatever you want. And this is where we're going to keep the name Rex here. So this is a global Rex. These guys right here are local to the component, local to the component. This guy is global. So that's our default state. So our state that we pass into main reducer is going to be equal to default state. And just like that, that's our default state for our global state. Now, what's the body of our reducer? Well, for now, all we're going to do is it expects you. In every reducer, you have to return an object. That object's job is to override the default state. This is how main reducer is updating global state. So for now, just for now, we're going to return the default state like that. And we're going to get into like writing code here. But just for now, we're returning the default state. All right, so we've created a global state. We've created a store. First step. Second store is a reducer that manages the store. Third step is we wrap our app in a provider and give it the shop it's going to be providing from. How do we consume this? What's the other half of the coin? Well, let's do with the welcome header. So we go to welcome header over here. There are two steps to consuming from a store. The first step is we have to connect to the store. So we deal with a method called connect, and we get that from React Redux like this. And then we wrap our component before we export it in a connect using these double argument listings. Now, if you don't know what these double argument listings mean, this syntax right here, there's a function written for us called connect. It's in React Redux. I think it is, probably is. And so there's a function called connect. It has an argument listing. And within that function, there's another function. It's probably anonymous, has another argument listing. This double argument listing, double parentheses business, says to run the function within connect. And so we're passing this welcome header component into a function within connect, and it's doing some sort of business, and it's returning a bunch of stuff for us. And so that's the first step. We import connect, and we connect our component to the store. The second step is we fill out the argument listing of connect. There are two arguments. Let me say map state to props, and then there's an action or dispatch actions. We'll get to the second argument in the latter half of the video. Let's tackle the first guy. This is how we consume from the store. Now, map state to props is a function. We could write the function in the argument listing in the signature, but it's going to look messy, so we're going to take it out. And this guy gets the global state passed into it from the connect function. So that's how we're able to use global state in our local component here. So how do we do it? Well, map state to props, this first argument here, expects you to return an object. And the keys to that object right here, they're what you want to call the data within the local state. So we're going to call the name that we're going to get from the local state, from the global state, excuse me. We're going to call it name from store. The value is obviously the actual global state. So we're going to say global underscore state, and we're going to take the name from the global state. So just like that, now in our program, we have access to the global state name by using the actual the local name from store. So we can change this guy. Let me comment that guy out, comment this guy in. It's no longer props.name, it's name from store. And it's automatically hooked up in this code right here. It's hooked up to your props. It's not simply just hanging out like this. It's from your props like this. If this was a class, it would be this.props, but since this is a function component, it's just props. So just like that, we've connected to the store, and now we're using the global state within our local component. Let's go to the front end and see what we get. We get welcome blank. Now, why are we getting blank? Well, we overrid our default state with a blank object. Let's override it with an actual name. Let's say name law like this. Back to the front end, and we get la here. Now, how do we get the default Rex? Well, we can't just pass a blank object as you saw because we just get a nothing, right? We have to omit the argument entirely. Now we go back to the front end and we get this guy's global right here. And these guys are still local to their component. Let's change that. Let's connect these guys up to the store. So we're going to go into blog post, and blog post sends the name down to blog image. So we only need to connect a blog post up to the store. So you guys know the drill. We import connect from React Redux. We hook up our component with the connect like this, double parenthesis work. And then we have a map state to props, which I'm just going to steal from this component because I don't want to write it twice. There we go. And then we fill out the argument listing. First argument maps the state to the props. And then we can use it within our local context here, which is right here. I'm going to comment these two guys out. I'm going to copy these guys, paste, comment them back in. And it's no longer this .props.name. It's name from store like this. So now when we go to the front end, let me change the default name just so we know it's working. We go to the front end, and just like that, we're consuming the global state into these local components. How do we influence it? How do we change global state? Well, we have to use something called dispatch. So let me go back here, change this guy to Rex, and let's get influencing the global state. All right. So when we connect to, and we're going to do it with the blog post, because in the blog post, I created an input. It doesn't work right now, obviously. We change the name. When we hit change name, it should change all of these rexes to whatever we wrote in this input field. And so when we connect to a store, implied in that is given to us is a function called dispatch. And dispatch returns an object. So let's go up to where I hit change name. When I hit the button, it's going to run this.changeName, which is this guy right here. So as soon as we connect to the store, we get a function called dispatch that gets passed into your props, just like the local state does. And this guy is a class component, so it's this.props.dispatch. And dispatch job is to return an object. And so best practices, what do? Well, we have a type, and then we have a payload. The type is a type, it tells the dispatch, it tells the reducer what to do. And the payload is the data that it does it with. So our type is just going to be change name. And our payload is going to be whatever they enter in this field here, which I hooked up to this.state.newName.current.value, like that. Why isn't this working? There we go. .value. This.state.newName, is that it? This.state.newName.current.value. All right, that should work. So dispatch, once you run dispatch, this is the guy that catches it, your reducer, because your reducer manages the store. It changes the store, right? Or the state of the store. And that dispatch, it shows up in your action. So what you do is, we're going to code it like this. We're going to create a switch, and we're going to be evaluating the action.type. Because you can have many different types of, You have many different types of dispatches. You can dispatch change name, maybe you want to change a number. For this guy, we're saying change the name. So the reducer comes in and it says, okay, what's the action type? Well, our action type is change name. So what do you want me to change once you've told me you want to change the name? Well, I want you to return an object that's going to override the default state. It's going to update the name to the data you gave me, or the data I gave you, which is action.payload like this. And we'll have a default case. And we'll say for default, just return the default state like that. All right. And so that's how we're going to change the global state. We're going to use a prop called dispatch that we get from our connect. And the job of dispatch is to give an object with a type and a payload. How do I change the state, or how is the reducer going to change the state, and what data is it going to change it with? And so a dispatch or a reducer catches that. It evaluates the type. That we could have named that type this, but we'd also have to mirror that change right here like this. But just best practices, you name it type. So we're going to evaluate the type, and we're going to say, it's going to say, okay, I'm going to change the name. What am I going to change the name to? Well, we gave you the name in the payload, so I'm going to change it to the payload. Let's go to the front end and see if it works. Let's change the name to tungsten like this. Hit the change name, and there we go. We're influencing the global state by using a function called dispatch, which we get from the connect function, and that updates or propagates that change throughout the whole app. Now let's tackle the second argument of connect. So what is it? Well, the first argument, it maps global state to local props. The second argument, you could say it maps actions or dispatches to local props. And so connect expects this second argument to be one of two things, either a function or an object. Now the function way of writing it is a bit more complex, so we'll handle that first and then we'll move on to the object. So we're going to say function map action to props. And so just like this first argument, connect gave it a global state. The second argument right here, connect gives us a dispatch, the very same dispatch we use up here. So what's the whole point of this? Like without the second argument, our app was working just fine. We could change the name, we could change the global state. Why do we even need to bother with the second argument? Well, let me just close off this. And this is going to return an object, which we'll get to in a second. So what's the point of the second argument? Well, let's say, for the sake of argument, when you click that button, we're triggering this function. But for the sake of argument, let's say this function, it didn't make sense to logically put it in the class. What if we want to take this function outside of this class, but still have a dispatch? Because maybe we wanted to export this function so other components could use it. Well, as soon as we take this change name outside of the class, there's no longer any sense of this stop props. That goes away. And so it loses dispatch. It loses the ability to call this function. This is the whole point of mapping actions to props, is that we can map a local prop within our component and have that call a function that exists outside of our component and still have access to dispatch. I'll show you what I mean. And so this is going to return, just like this guy returned a local prop name from store, and it bound it, or its value was a global state name. This guy has a local prop name. We're going to call the prop name, let's just say from outside, so we know which one we're running. From outside class change name. And the value is a function. And within this function, when we call this from the props, it runs this function right here that exists outside of the local state of this class component. So I'm going to take all of this code right here. Let's comment it out first. I'm going to take this, go down here. And so we're essentially just dispatching from outside of the class instead of inside of the class. So let's uncomment this. There's no longer any sort of this.props. It's just straight to dispatch. Now, how do we get the payload then, right? Because this.state only exists within our blog content component. Well, we pass it in through here. So new name is going to be here. And instead of this.state.new name current value, we're just going to say new name. So now when we run this function, just like we ran or used the global name from the store like this, using this.props, we bound a local prop name to a global state. We've just bound a local function name or prop function name to an actual function that exists outside of the class. So when we use it, when you click that button, instead of dispatching from within the component, we'll call this function, which exists outside of the component, and pass it in the new name. So .current.value. Let's go to the front end and see if we broke the code. So just rename to Lala. Change name. And there we go. We get the same result. We're still influencing the global state, but we're dispatching from outside of the class. That's the whole point of this second argument. So what's the second way of writing this thing? And what's the difference? Why would you use one or the other? Well, this is a function, so we can have code within here before we do any sort of returns. So if you want to do any sort of complicated algorithms before you return, you'd use the function. If you want to keep it simple, which is like 95% of the cases, we just use the second option, which is an object. And that object is a list. So I'm going to redefine this guy to be actions. It's a list of actions that get dispatched. So actions, we'll say const actions. Did I say actions or actions? Actions is equal to a list. And it's a key value pair thing. It's an object. So let's say we had, and so why do we need this one? So we need this one because it allows us to run a function outside of the class. And it's a function, so we can do complicated code before we return. So this list one, let's say we had a function called from outside class change name. It accepts a new name. And it's going to return not a dispatch, but just the object that the dispatch returns itself or expects, which is just this thing right here. So I'm going to copy this. I'm going to put it in here. We're going to put it in here now. Hold on. Let's do a copy. Let's go here. I control paste. Perfect. And we won't need this. We're just going to return an object. We need this. There we go. Let's do proper formatting. Object, object, object. That looks better. All right, so we have a function that exists outside of the class context. It's not dispatching right away. I'll show you where the dispatch happens. So the point of this list is, what if we had 18 different functions? What if we had a function change from outside class change name? Let's say from outside class change, and obviously these aren't wired to anything, but just go with me. Like we had 18, I'm just going to do 3. We had 18 different functions, right? Change name, number, let's say occupation. Well, what this list allows us to do is to implicitly use dispatch within all of these functions. So I'll show you. So we have actions and their key value pairs. The key can be whatever you want. So I'm going to say JJ is equal to the from dispatch class change name. I'm going to say KK is equal to from outside change number. And then I'm going to say MM is equal to from outside class change occupation. And so now these guys are implicitly getting a dispatch. And what does that look like? What that would look like would be something like this. Let's say, how would I write this? It'd be a function that calls dispatch, like this, and you're passing in the return value of this function. Well, what's the return value of this function? It's itself an object. So what you're really writing with this is dispatch type equals change name, and payload is whatever the payload is, new name, whatever, like that. But the way React Redux works is you can just use shorthand like this, and it's implied that this dispatch gets run, and whatever this returns right here, it gets put in as the first argument of your dispatch. So we're going to delete this. We're going to go back to from outside class change name, and there's a comma there, and we're wired actions. So this guy's not being used. We can keep that. So let's go back to our front page. Actually, no, here. So we redefine those actions as JJ, KK, MM. So instead of from outside class change name, JJ, just like that. So let's go back to the front end. Let's see if we influence the global state. Let's just say, I don't know, MERP. There we go, change name. And we're getting a change on the global state. So another way to condense this, you wouldn't normally write it like this. Why would you have your function name be different from the prop name you use? All you have to do, if you're going to use the same prop name like this is a bit of, I don't know what is ES6, ES8. If you're going to say something like this, you don't need to have the key value pair explicit like this. You can just pass in that. So just one name if it's going to be the same value. So this is how we're listing. So any sort of, or any entry within this actions list implicitly gets this dispatch. This is why we'd use the object way of writing the second argument. It's just easier, especially if you have these functions existing outside of your outside of this file. You need to do some asyncs, but if it exists outside of the file and you just import a bunch of functions out here, like import all of your different functions like that, and then you list all your functions in here, well, then they implicitly get the dispatch object. So just another way of wiring actions to local props in your global state. And again, the only reason you use this second argument is if you need, logically, it makes sense to take functions that exist within the class and take them out of the class. And so that's going to be it for this video. It wasn't too confusing. I hope you have a better grasp of how React Redux works, how you create a store and then connect to the store to consume from the store. And then the other half of this, which is if you want to map actions to props, so the functions, the dispatches happen outside of your class component, you know how to do that as well. So don't forget to give a like, subscribe if you haven't already subscribed, share, comments down below, and I'll see you guys in the next one.